We are on a very special property. This is a 380-acre property that is owned by the Sturgeon Bay Utilities, of which 332 acres we hope to be able to purchase and protect and sort of make it into a permanent nature preserve. And before we talk a little bit about the property and why we're interested and why the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provided us a grant and the state of Wisconsin is considering providing 50% of the funding for this property, maybe take a step back and give you some history about the ownership of this tract and about how we've come about to recognize it as a place that we want to spend considerable time and resources in order to protect. As some of you know, following the Burke County Land Trust over the years, we started a concerted effort over about 10 years ago to sort of go out and identify the best of the best places in Burke County, whether it's the ecological hotspots or those areas that have tremendous scenic value. We were sort of answering the question, if we had $1 million, where would we spend it? And it's always good to know the answer to that question, just in case somebody ever calls with that proposal. No one's called yet with that, but we do have the answer now. We've, through the work of the Nature Conservancy, who's hired Mike Grimm up here in 1994 to have the best job in the world, which was go out and snoop around and take bird counts and plant and animal inventories and tell us where the best of the best is here in Burke County from an ecological standpoint. So the Nature Conservancy's been doing that. The state of Wisconsin, of course, has a lot of scientists that have spent time up here, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, now the Burke County Land Trust. And so we've had a pretty good idea of where the places are in Burke County that deserve protection. And that's what we've set out to do. We sort of really, that kind of climaxed in the 2006 when we started our 20th anniversary capital campaign, and we basically pledged that we're going to protect 20 special places. And these aren't necessarily one property. Sometimes they're landscape level properties like the Bayshore Blufflands, which is thousands of acres in size. But we set up these project areas and we began to talk to the landowners and began to do protection work at all these places. And one of those places that was on the top of our wish list, as well as the top of many conservationist lists, was the area that we're sitting in the middle of here, which is, we call it, from more of a, we need a new word for this, but we call it the Shivering Sands to Claybanks State Natural Area.
Actually, it's Cave Point to Claybanks.
Cave Point to Claybanks. So we got the C thing going. All right, that's better. It's this region of probably about 5 miles up the lakeshore here, running about 5 miles down the lakeshore, and including this whole area in which we have a large intact forest community, and we have ancient shorelines, and it's an area that is very diverse in itself. Every property within this range here is quite different. And one of the centerpieces of this whole area, this 12-mile area, if you will, is the property we're on here today, this 380-acre site. And that is why in 2002 we began having direct talks with the Sturgeon Bay Utilities about the idea of being able to protect this place for the public and for the birds and the plants on a permanent basis. To give you an idea of how the utilities ended up with this property, is this property was actually owned for several decades in the 60s and 70s and early 80s by Wisconsin Public Service. And WPS acquired this tract because this was going to be the site of a coal-fired power plant. And it was obviously long enough, that plan was farther along to the point where WPS actually acquired the property. But at the same time, in the 60s and early 70s, another energy movement was taking hold, and that was nuclear power. And suddenly nuclear power started to come in favor to the utilities. And there was plans for nuclear power plants, dozens of them, around Lake Michigan itself. Well, several of them were constructed. And this site lost favor in terms of a nuclear power plant site and lost out to Kewaunee County. And so Kewaunee County is where the power plant ended up being built. And WPS now ended up with a site that use for a coal-fired power plant was in less demand. And so they never did follow through with that plan, and then they decided that they needed to sell the property. So in 1994, they officially said we're selling it, and at that time, Sturgeon Bay Utilities, who was actually owned by the city of Sturgeon Bay, thought it would be a great idea if the utilities would purchase the land. At that time, there was talks about wastewater treatment plants, water intake systems, the infrastructure, if you will, the utility infrastructure for the city. And what if the wells go bad, or what if we wanted to site the wastewater treatment plant and we needed to be close to Lake Michigan? So for $277,000, the utilities purchased the land from WPS, and that's how it came in their ownership. Well, as you can see, 25 years later, there's no wastewater treatment plant out here. There's no wells and water intake systems going out to the lake. And what has happened is the wells that Sturgeon Bay relies on is functioning perfectly well. The wastewater treatment plant is situated elsewhere. So the utilities is faced with, and has been for several years they've known with, is that they own 380 acres, of which they don't need most of that land. And they have passed several resolutions at their commission that they have excess land that they're going to sell. But one great thing that they have done in the meantime is that they've let the public come onto the property. And as many of you know, it's sort of been used as a de facto public park for many, many years. And in fact, they have a month-to-month lease with the town of Sturgeon Bay to operate the sand dunes and the beach area as a town park. That can be rescinded within a month's notice, so it's not a permanent thing, but it's a neat thing that the utilities has recognized the fact that the public loves this place and has allowed them to come out here. On any given day, you'll see people using the beach. You'll see fishermen, fisherwomen out here, hikers. The school district uses the property. Carl Cochran brings his ecology class out here several times throughout the year to do work, and learning and retirement groups come out here. So it's just it's already a public asset. And what we want to do from the land trust perspective is just make that a permanent basis. So because the utilities have made it known that they need to sell the land, they've done engineering studies to determine what amount of land should they hold on to in case the wells do fail. Kind of what if infrastructure is needed here. And out of 380 acres, their engineering firm told them that they need a grand total of 10 acres of land. So they own a lot of excess land here that they really owe it to their ratepayers to give back to, in essence, that they're not in the job of running nature preserves, if you will. So the proposal that we've been working with the utilities on is out of the 380 acres, 332 acres will be purchased by the Door County Land Trust and turned into a permanent public nature preserve. 10 acres will be owned by the utilities, and the other 48 acres is an open area where the dredging spoils that have happened over the years in the canal and in the bay area are disposed of, and it's a site that is still can take more dredge spoils. So 38 acres will continue to be an area where the dredge spoils will be, and the utilities will continue to own that as well. So the concept is in place, the engineering studies are done, the surveys are done, the appraisals are done. We even have a beautiful map here that shows us the preserve concept. It's in your packets when you get a chance to look at that. But as you can see, it's a mile along the ship canal. It's got a little under 800 feet of Lake Michigan shoreline, and it goes a mile back on Lake Lane all the way back to about 180 acre cedar wetland forest in the very back of the property. But Mike will talk a little bit about the ecology of the interior area when we get up into the ancient shorelines. But it's really a unique place because it's one of the last places in Door County, certainly of this size, it is the last places where you can go from the open waters of Lake Michigan up into the dune system, out into the ancient shorelines, and then back into the cedar swamp without really any interruption. So it's a very neat study of what Door County used to look like, and it's actually still a living, very dynamic area, as evidenced by that some of these dunes up here are new in the last 15 years. So some of these ridge swales and dunes are still being created and still moving, and it's still a very dynamic system. And what that leads to is to have rare habitat, which leads to rare plants and animals that rely on that habitat. And one of the species that is of concern out in the dunes area is called the dunes thistle. And I know that there's some right back.
Right here?
Yep, Laurel has one there. They were in bloom about 3 weeks ago. but the dune thistle obviously relies on this type of environment, which you don't see very much in terms of undisturbed environment. Ah, thank you. So anyway, the rare habitat leads to rare plant and animals and the presence of that. So of course that's an interest. It's a very popular bird area, as well as this is a popular migratory flyway for migratory songbirds. And we have our loud gulls out there. You'll see Caspian terns out there, which are a neat rare bird. It's an area that's used by bald eagles and osprey. So all in all, it's just a wonderful site. And as you can see, the beauty of it is unrivaled too. So not only do we have great habitat, but we have a place with the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal in the back, and the canal itself just offering sort of an unmatched scenic component to it as well. Laurel's going to talk on our hike. We'll stop at one point, and she'll talk about how in the heck are we raising $2 million to put this deal together. And Mike will talk a little bit about the ecology when we get back in the woods. So the plan for the hike would be to kind of make our way back, go back into the ancient shoreline systems, do a loop and come down the canal trail, as we call it, and we'll come right back to this particular site and loop it around.
Mike, do you want to add a little bit to the ecology of the place we're standing right here?
Yes, I think as Dan alluded to, this is a great place to look at the succession of the beaches here. You can see the willows and the aspen growing along the high beach line there, going right back to the pines and the cedars back there. It rivals the ridge swale succession you see at Jackson Harbor in Washington Island, or the Ridge of Sanctuary in Bailey's Harbor. And many of the same plants are found in all three places, so it's a very neat place to start exploring.
Mm-hmm. You have any questions at this point, and we'll get out of the sun and go back into the forest? Yeah.
I'll just make a comment. It's not a question.
Sure.
I have a cottage halfway between here and Silverdale, and for years the property was just sand. Loved it. And now it's filling in with these ridges and swales, and I'm just amazed at how fast it's happening.
Yeah, and it's the lower lake levels. In 1996, as you probably know, we had a high water event, 95, 94, and followed quickly by probably 1998, 99, it went down tremendously. It has started to come back again, but I think that succession is in direct relationship to the water levels that are happening on Lake Michigan over the last 15 years, if I'm right.
Yes, you are right, and the amount of rainfall.
Yeah, we've had, I don't know annually whether or not every year we've been below, but I think all of us know that the springs here from April through June have been tremendously dry almost every year. Late winter and into our springs have been a very dry year here, so our wetlands aren't being fed as well as they perhaps used to be under other climatic times. So.
Correct.
What's the attitude of your neighbors to the south regarding the proposal?
Well, for them, really, life won't change too much. This is being leased as a town park right now, these 10 acres. So having that public use is not something that's suddenly going to be new to the neighborhood. It will be a continuation of what's happening. Perhaps I think that over time they'll come to realize that things will actually be strengthened out here in terms of right now the utilities are the first to admit that they don't know how to run, or they're not in the business of running nature preserves. So sometimes you get unintended uses out here that those are the things that we want to work to hold down. You have ATV use, which are on the dune system, especially in the center of the portion, that has to be at least attempted to educate and to control that use. A trail system needs to be put in place where we want to direct most of the traffic, if at all possible. So if you build the trail, they will come, and hopefully they'll follow the trails and kind of keep some of the fragile areas less trampled, if you will. So I think between, and we'll put educational kiosks up and educational information. So I think it would actually be an enhancement to what's here. So right here, what's happening now is public come on, but no one's watching, no one's looking, and anything goes. And perhaps if we are able to form partnerships with the Door County Parks Department, with some partners we're trying to reach out to, it will be a situation where it will be actually a better quality experience for people coming out here, and I think that the neighbors would appreciate that.
And they're very excited because every once in a while in the city government there comes a new idea along, whether it by an industrial harbor off of the canal, or a few years ago they decided that they would log the property. And fortunately it picked a winter that the loggers couldn't work very long and that project was stopped. But every once in a while an idea comes along that scares the people quite a bit along here. And I know some of them are very comfortable with the idea of the land trust being involved.
Right. About 10 years ago, re-emerged there was a presentation by a group who wanted to rekindle the idea of a coal-fired power plant here. Really there has been studies and extensive studies done over the last 10 years about alternatives to conservation out here. And I think the utilities, though, is very supportive. In fact, in their resolution, they actually passed resolutions saying they need to sell and want to sell the property, but ideally for conservation purposes. So they're out on the forefront with us here and trying to make this happen. So we really owe them a big thanks in terms of being leaders and knowing that green infrastructure is an important part to a community. And as a utility, it's nice that they have that understanding. So.
And the citizens of Sturgeon Bay have spoken. We did a petition in 2005 and got several thousand signatures of people that really would like to see this as some type of preserve.
All right. So I think we're going to continue up the road for a few hundred feet. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can you be more specific what the plan is? Number one, for the improvements for the entire property, and obviously with the improvements would be right along the shoreline here. And then where you come up with the funding for that, and who would do the maintenance on that?
Yeah, great questions. First and foremost, this is going to be a nature preserve. It's not going to be sort of a typical county park or state park, and there's a big distinction in that. So from its use standpoint, what you're looking at is hiking, swimming, wildlife viewing, and those type of uses. Vehicles, from the grants that we're getting and really our own policy, vehicles will not be allowed on the property other than on parking areas and roads. And so it's for outdoor recreation purposes. So in terms of infrastructure that will be added, we're talking about probably putting a marked trail system in. That would get people to the sites of interest. That will certainly be a big part of what we will do up front in the first few years, is put a nice trail system in. We also want to put educational components on, so there might be a series of kiosks that will be erected with trail maps, the story about the canal, the history, the ecology of the area. So there'll be an educational component. There probably will also be a small parking area in the center of the property that will be created as another trailhead. So not only could you access the beach and hike off of there, but you can also start in the center of the property. Being a mile long, it's quite a big property, and the center of the property is very distinct and very different from the beach area. So there'll probably be another center point, if you will, of the preserve in the center, where there'll be a small parking area with kiosks and educational information where you could walk a guided hiking trail. But that's probably it. I mean, the biggest infrastructure that we may put in would be a porta toilet. That's our big plans for buildings or structures. We're getting grants for wildlife protection. That's first and foremost. And by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Wisconsin giving these wildlife grants to us, that's the primary purpose. And so they have restrictions that come with it, where we can't put campgrounds in, ballparks, buildings, that sort of thing. So it's going to be a nature preserve type of thing. Day-to-day use, we are working, and we've already talked to the town of Sturgeon Bay, who's operating the park right now. We've made 2 presentations to them. We've made a few presentations to the Door County Parks staff and now their committee, and we've got another one set up. So we're hoping to form relationships because this is a huge job out here and we can't do it alone. So we're hoping to form a management partnership with a group like the Door County Parks Department. Our vision is we will continue to own the property, but perhaps some management agreements will be entered into it to allow us to form some partnerships in the day-to-day management of the place.
And as far as putting the trails and that sort of thing, would that be done like on a volunteer basis?
Well, we do have a couple of staff folks that it's their envious job to go out and mark trails, and but what they basically do is coordinate a large volunteer corps. And so, yeah, it will be a combination of some staffing with a lot of the people here today. I know that have been out on our work. And the other issue is invasive plants. It's not a perfect place. Many places in Door County have issues that this property does with invasive plants. Honeysuckle, buckthorn being the, and a little Phragmites being the species of concern. And so we've got to look from a staff standpoint and putting the management plan together is what is our goals in terms of the invasive plant problem. Is it complete eradication? Is it control? And those are some issues that we haven't put details to yet that have to be worked out. And that again is a combination of getting a lot of volunteer help, as well as this is a large scale problem, maybe hire contractors out to work on the invasive plant issue.
I heard from one of my neighbors that they have a program, if you remove invasive species from your house, so let's say you go on cut honeysuckle, you guys get a certain amount of credit towards the purchase of this?
Yeah, we put a grant proposal in 2007 to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and basically you're competing with all the states in the nation, and only 16 grants are given out. And one of the things that they like to see is going out and form new partnerships. Just don't do it yourself, form partnerships. So we've talked to the South Lake Michigan Drive Association, we've talked to the Lake Forest Park Road Corporation and the Sturgeon Bay schools, and asked them that if we apply for this grant, do you guys want to be partners on here, where in which you will help eradicate on a volunteer basis plant species in the neighborhood and here on this site. And we have got all those groups who are very enthusiastic, and hundreds of hours of volunteer time has been committed. And if we're able to put this purchase together, everybody is committed to doing that work according to the terms of the grant proposal we put together. So you'll have the school groups out here, the landowner associations, and we'll be tracking their volunteer time because that was part of the grant.
And then lastly, about the shoreline here, I noticed in your map there, it kind of has the area marked off from where the breakwater is to the canal. What was the plan with that?
Yeah.
Coast Guard wanted to retain ownership?
Yep, well, yeah, they did. From day one of the construction of the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal, the Army Corps of Engineers owns 100 feet along each side of the canal. And so, which is great because it's already public property, if you will. So public access is allowed. But whoever owns the property, hopefully it would be us. We're not responsible for the breakwall maintenance. So the Army, so the Army Corps owns the first 100 feet from the water.
Okay.
Yeah.
Many of you are familiar with the running club moss, and I saw some Princess Pine club moss a little while ago. Mixed in with that, there is some of the wintergreen, and I picked a couple of wintergreen leaves that you can crush and smell. It has a wonderful smell, and also produces a berry that's great for wildlife and for you if you can find it before them. But the highlight of this stop is right here, the Indian pipe or the corpse plant. It supposedly looks like a pipe. It's called a corpse plant because it has a cool, clammy touch to it. And once it's through producing its seeds, or you pick it, it turns a brown and then a black color. Native Americans and herbalists use this plant for a remedy for eye problems. They'd mash it and mix it with water, and it was good for eye irritation. So it's a really neat plant that does not produce its own chlorophyll. It's living off of something that's rotting in the soil there. And if you would just kick away a little bit of the top here, you'll find it's all sand. In some places on these ridges, you'll also see beach stones to testify that it was beach stones shoved up here by the ice. And going The further we go west, the older the beach lines are. And how many were identified in here? Do you remember, Dan?
23?
23 beach lines. We're probably talking about 2 or at least 3,000 years worth of succession in here, looking at these 23 beach lines. And that also allows us to walk from the pioneer plants almost back to what the climax would be in a wetland like this, the big cedars. Also in this area you're seeing, besides the cedar trees, you're seeing some balsam fir. And in the parking lot, we were looking at these earlier, and they had a double set of needles. You can see in here they just have one flat set of needles because that's the best way to absorb light in a very filtered atmosphere like this. And there's some good sized hemlock in here too, the northern hemlock.
Mike, straight through there is one of the really big ones.
Yes. Hemlock's kind of an interesting tree in that the wood was never really sought after because it's a soft wood, but it's very brittle and hard to drive a nail in and splinters. But the bark in the days of tanning hides was so valuable they would cut the tree down, strip the bark, bale it up, and sell the bark. And it was used in the tanning of hides. Besides the big pesticle fire, which did affect this area, there are some smaller fires. It was a very dry time, and sometimes there were very localized fires too, and you'll only see a few stumps in an area, where there are places not far from here where you see a whole field of stumps that are charred by the pesticle fire. But it's a natural succession, and I'm sure we'll see some of those stumps up ahead.
And we took a big ridge back, and we're probably sitting about right here. And as you can see, we're probably 30% of the way up this trail, and this is a neat trail that we just, well, it's been here. We just found it last month. So like, all right, this is done. Because it stays up on top for most of the way, and it does open up in some points where it's just got magnificent views. Further up at the highest point, which is actually up in here, I think it's one of the best views in the county. I mean, it's much higher than here, and it's open, and you can see the canal and the open waters of the bay. So this will be, something that will be, not much work has to be done to it to kind of make part of a nice little loop here. Up here on just to the west of the property boundary is Strawberry Creek, which is a very important. It's actually a Great Lakes tributary. It flows into Sturgeon Bay. But up here, maybe a half mile up the creek is the DNR operates a fish hatchery facility, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest, Chinook salmon egg stocking facility on Lake Michigan. And if you go up Strawberry Lane off of U, go down Strawberry Lane, maybe in October, early November. And you'll see the salmon running the river trying to get back up to the facility, and it's just magnificent because it's only 3 feet wide and maybe 2 feet deep at its best, the stream, and it's just filled with salmon. So if you have grandkids in town or something like that, and it's October or November day, take them down to there. That'll be pretty impressive. But the western half of this property does drain into what we would call the Strawberry Creek watershed. And actually, there's a pipeline that runs through on top of the ground that runs across the canal property that feeds water on low water level years in the creek, which this year probably will be one of those years. They'll pump some water in order to keep the water high enough to operate the facility, because they ran into some years where there wasn't enough water to do what they needed to do, and so they do have to do some artificial manipulations depending on the year from time to time. So.
And one of the things that's taken for granted too, I don't know how many of you are boaters or whatever, but this is one of the most beautiful boating areas here because both sides are undeveloped. And it's just beautiful coming into Sturgeon Bay because of that.
We are standing at the very end of the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal, and on the other side of the canal there's a large stone on the recreational trail that sort of tells the history of the canal, and we're lucky enough to know the person who put that piece together, so he emailed it to us. So what I'll do is just read you this piece, which sort of tells you everything you need to know about the canal and when it was created and why. So if you give me 2 minutes of reading. This canal was the dream of Joseph Harris Sr., who is known as the father of the Sturgeon Bay and Lake Michigan Ship Canal. His intent was not only to provide a shorter and safer route for sailing vessels, but to also become rich by selling building lots along the canal in the town in which he would name Harrisburg, that would surely result along the lake end of the canal. After much work, lobbying, and a change in the canal location, a state charter was granted in 1864 to his Sturgeon Bay and Lake Michigan Ship Canal and Harbor Company to begin work 3/4 of a mile south of the projected Harrisburg. Harris never realized a financial gain on the sale of his property, and Harrisburg, the town, well, that was never built. In 1871, the federal government constructed a harbor of refuge on Lake Michigan at the place where the canal would emerge, and that is right here. Construction of a lighthouse and fog signal at the end of the breakwater was recommended in 1873, but the light was not built until 1882. Construction of the canal began in 1872, but the Depression of 1873 held up work for 3 years. Construction resumed in 1877, and on June 28, 1878, at 7:30 p.m. to be exact, the final shovelful of dirt were removed to allow the mixing of the waters of Sturgeon Bay and Lake Michigan. There is little written record about the canal laborers, but we do know a fair number of local men were hired, along with men from the outside who were promised good wages. The first loaded ship towed through the canal was the 3-masted schooner America, bound for Chicago in 1879 with a load of lumber. It would take another 4 years to complete the 7,400-foot canal to the specifications needed for the sailing vessels of the 1880s. The first full year of operation in 1882 showed that 415 ships passed through the canal. 10 years later, that number increased nearly tenfold to 3,949. During the early years of the canal, a tow charge was levied on the ships that passed through. Local tug owners provided towing services for the ships using the canal, and competition was keen, as whoever got to the ship first got the job. The ship owners found that they could split the charges by linking up and being towed through in a group. The big tow, as it was called, is a group of sailing vessels that were joined together by tow ropes in their passage through the canal. The completion of the canal reduced the trip distance from Green Bay to Milwaukee and Chicago by 150 miles and eliminated the dangerous journey through the Death's Door Passage at the tip of the Door Peninsula. There's some wonderful photographs from the late 1880s, including a picture of the big tow, and I'll just kind of pass this around. I forgot to mention they do have to maintain a water depth here of, I think, 26 feet in order to accommodate the big lakers and other vessels that come through here. And so that is why there's a need from time to time for dredging projects to happen, and why the dredge spoils are put onto the middle part of the site here.
Who owns the property on the other side?
Homeland Security, Coast Guard, and then again, about a 100-foot strip is owned by the Army Corps, and they actually do have, if you've ever been on it, it's been there for many, many years. Not well publicized, not many people know about it, but there is a recreational trail that runs the top of the berm that was put there, and there's parking lots area in there, as well as a plaque with the history of the canal. It's definitely worth a walk, because on top of the berm you can see the city of Sturgeon Bay in the background, and it's even a higher berm than this one here. Somebody on a previous walk was commenting about why each side is bermed up, 50, 60 feet high, and the thought was, and they heard, that it's to reduce the wind that would be at the bottom of the canal because of the narrow passage, to make it a little bit less windy. But I don't know. I mean, you could also argue that berming it up would create this wind tunnel. So, but that's what someone was saying. Yeah. Any questions about the canal itself?
Is the berm the result of the dirt that was dug out of the canal?
I would think so. I'm not so sure so much about this side, but definitely that side. Wouldn't you think, Mike?
I would think so, yes. They did, with teams of horses, they did have some mechanical things, but a lot of it was done by hand and with horses.
So they wouldn't have been hauling it far away?
They wouldn't have hauled it far away, no.
So just shovels and men?
Shovels and a scoop that you pull behind horses. They did have some steam shovel work in here too, but a lot of it was hand labor. In fact, one of the places that the laborers stayed in was a log cabin that was on Cap Wolf's property, who lives along Cove Road. That log cabin is now transplanted to the farm. It's their nature center at the farm. It's a beautiful white pine log cabin that was the office for the canal project. Cove Road. It's along the water on the other side on the bay.
Well, I think we'll talk about some exciting things that happened to us over the past year in terms of making this possible, and maybe paint a picture for you of what the next 3 or 4 months could look like.
And jump in if you think of anything I've left out. But basically, about 2 years ago, the Land Trust applied for a U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant. We applied for it and were awarded a $1 million coastal wetland grant. And these grants are designed to protect the most ecologically valuable coastlines in the United States. And as Dan mentioned earlier, 16 of these grants were given away, and one was received by the Door County Land Trust for use in this area. That grant, along with monies from the Wisconsin Knowles Nelson State Stewardship Fund, will account for about a little under 80% of what we need for the purchase price of this property, for the 332 acres and the 750 feet of Lake Michigan shoreline. The signed purchase offer is just under $1.9 million. And what the Land Trust is responsible for to see that this project is completed for the rest of the purchase dollars and for the stewardship costs, the stewardship dollars we'll need. We will need to go to the Door County community and people who are supportive of land conservation for the additional just under $300,000 to make this project become a reality. We're hoping on Tuesday the City Council will vote to approve the sale of this property to the Land Trust, and then that's in some ways when our work really begins, because once we know that it's in our court, then we will be out talking to our supporters and talking to the community and leading more hikes, letting people know that this place is here, and asking everyone to do what they can to help. And I think if all of us and all the people who want to see this handed down to the next generation jump in, we'll be successful. We need to raise these funds in the next few months, so you'll be hearing more and more about the effort and how we're doing. I think we've all walked at Potawatomi State Park or the Ridges Sanctuary, and you think, who had the foresight? Who did the work to make sure that this place is here? And the names are forgotten, but you can take your family, and you don't have to own 100 acres to go sit outside and enjoy it. And that this is our turn. I mean, this is our turn to do something good that's going to be appreciated for a long, long time. And that's really exciting. It's exciting to have the opportunity to do that. And we appreciate you talking to friends and telling them about this. And if you see our hikes listed in the paper, come out and see the property, and we'll get the job done.
We're sort of getting ready for a yes vote at the council, but it shouldn't be taken for granted. We're not that well known in the Sturgeon Bay area. A lot of our preserve work is done where there's a lot of undeveloped open spaces, which does not always fit the criteria of an urban environment. So if you do have the chance to call, email, write the mayor's office, if you live in the city, certainly a call to your council member would be very, very helpful at this point. But we're cautiously optimistic, and in fact, on Wednesday morning, we're going to have a press release all set to announce that our fundraising campaign will begin on the heels of the yes vote. And of course, we better have another one written, or we just tear it up. Right. So we have a few, just to know that I know a lot of you are Land Trust supporters, so it's kind of interesting to know how a deal happens. But within a purchase offer, we stick our neck out, but we don't stick it so far out that we're jeopardizing the organization. And this offer is contingent upon us receiving the grant monies, because in a bureaucracy situation, you never know what happens. So the stewardship fund Still some work needs to be done for that to be finalized. And so we have a contingency in the offer that we have until October 1st in order to feel comfortable enough about the grants. The Board of Directors has until September 21st to approve the purchase offer for any reason. So if fundraising isn't going well, if there's grants are in jeopardy, we have until September 21st as an organization. But after that October 1st date, which is the last of the contingencies, we're all legally bound to move forward, and the closing date is scheduled for December 15th. So it would be a great Christmas present, holiday present to give everybody if it all plays out and one of us is sitting at a title company on the 15th signing our name onto the documents. So.
Are there competitive proposals outstanding?
There's been, as we said, there's been other ideas about the property, but because the resolution that the Utility Commission passed was to sell the land for fair market value and preferably for conservation purposes, there hasn't been another conservation proposal that's been going forward with ours. So right now it's pretty much the city has to basically the yes or no on whether or not they want to go with the conservation route. This is the opportunity. There's not going to be another group that could come forward at this point. Our federal grant expires this winter, so once that grant goes away for us, we're out of the picture as well. So it's really, the time has come for the city to decide whether or not this is it. If it's not, the Utility Commission is on record of passing resolutions saying they're selling the property. So then it probably will be more of a situation where you probably get a whole bunch of new ideas and proposals that would go forward.
A lot of people ask about once the land trust protects the property, are we going to tell people they can't come out here because we're protecting a plant or a certain animal habitat? And it's actually contrary to that, because the land trust, by the grants that we receive by law, we must allow the public access to our property. So just like if people go on our website, the Door County Land Trust website, they can find out preserves we have all over the county that they can visit. And the same will be true for here too, that this will be open to the public for hiking, swimming, birding,
fishing,
educational
hunting
classes. Yeah, it's
according to the city ordinance. The city ordinance is fairly limited on the hunting opportunities out here, but there is bow hunting that is allowed. And as part of our management philosophy to help create an ecological balance, because we don't have wolves here anymore that are sort of creating an ecological balance, we do administer a deer hunting program on our properties, and we would continue to do here, but we would have to operate within city ordinance, which has firearm restrictions and that sort of thing.